Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Iran i Izrael su danas gorki neprijatelji, ali nije uvijek bilo tako. Iran je zapravo bio druga država sa većinskim muslimanskim stanovništvom koja je priznala nezavisnost Izraela i to 1950. godine, ubrzo nakon Turske. Ali odnosi su se pogoršali nakon Islamske revolucije 1979. godine i postali još lošiji u proteklih 10 godina, kako zbog iranskog nuklearnog programa, tako i zbog proaktivnije, a u trenucima i agresivnije iranske vanjske politike u regiji. U vrijeme Donalda Trumpa, koji je povukao Ameriku iz nuklearnog sporazuma sa Iranom i brojnim ubistvima iranskih nuklearnih naučnika i vojnih zvaničnika, situacija je u momentima bila na ivici rata. U ovom izdanju emisije analiziramo šta će se, ako išta, promijeniti sa Joe Bidenom u Bijeloj kući. Razgovaramo i o odnosima Irana sa susjednim arapskim zemljama i njihovim trgovinskim odnosima. Prije toga, pogledajmo uvodni prilog. Izrael i Iran su među rijetkim nearapskim državama na Bliskom istoku. Nemaju zajedničkih granica, niti otvorenih teritorijalnih pitanja, niti su ikad ratovali. Jevreji u Perziji, današnjem Iranu, žive duže od 2700 godina. Stoga, odakle je takav nivo animoziteta danas? Nakon proglašenja izraelske nezavisnosti 1948. godine, kada je Irak počeo progoniti svoje jevrijsko stanovništvo, Iran je poslužio iračkim Jevrejima kao tranzitna ruta i utočište na putu do Izraela. Iako je Iran glasao protiv UN-ove podjele Palestine 1947. godine, čim je proglašena država Izrael, Iran je odmah nakon Turske priznao jevrijsku državu i uspostavio diplomatske odnose 1950. godine. Iranu je Izrael bio potreban jer su željeli putem Tel Aviva i proizraelskih grupa u Americi steći blagonaklonost SAD-a u tadašnjem hladnom ratu i borbi protiv Sovjetskog saveza. 1950. i 60. godina sektaške podjele na šijski Iran i sunijski arapski svijet nisu bile izražene kao danas. Tada je Iranu najveća opasnost dolazila od panarapskog nacionalizma Džamala Abdel Nasera, potpomognutog Sovjetskim savezom. To ga je činilo prirodnim saveznikom Izraelu. Iz perspektive Izraela, Iran je nearapska muslimanska država u susjedstvu s kojom treba graditi odnose u skladu sa doktrinom periferije Davida Ben Guriona, koja nalaže jače odnose sa nearapima u susjedstvu, sa Turskom, Iranom, Etiopijom, kao i kršćanima u Libanu i Kurdima u Iraku. U tim godinama Iran i Izrael su tijesno sarađivali. Iran je rijetka država koja je u početku prodavala naftu Izraelu jer su arapske zemlje to odbijale učiniti. Koncem 1970. godina Izrael je pokrivao 80% svojih potreba naftom iz Irana. Zauzvrat, Iran je kupovao poljoprivredne i medicinske proizvode iz Izraela. 1960. i 70. godina Izrael je imao toliko inženjera i vojnih savjetnika u Teheranu da je čak bila otvorena škola na hebrejskom jeziku za njihovu djecu. Izraelska aviokompanija El Al imala je redovne letove između Tel Aviva i Teherana. Iran i Izrael su čak 1977. godine zajedno razvijali raketu dalekog dometa u okviru takozvanog projekta Cvijet, koja bi mogla nositi nuklearnu bojevu glavu. Ali je onda došlo do geopolitičkih promjena. Prvo, nakon smrti Abdel Nasera, na vlast u Egiptu je došao Anwar Sadat, a to je rezultiralo otopljenjem odnosa između Egipta i Irana. Zatim, 1975. godine Iran i Irak su potpisali sporazum na osnovu kojeg se Iran obavezao prekinuti podršku i naoružavanje kurdskih separatista u Iraku. To je na neki način smanjilo tenzije između Bagdada i Teherana, iako njihov međusobni rat nije zaustavljen. A nakon Islamske revolucije 1979. godine situacija se drastično promijenila. Svega 3 sedmice nakon dolaska Ajatollaha Homeinija na vlast, diplomatski odnosi sa Izraelom su prekinuti, dok je izraelska ambasada u Teheranu data na korištenje Palestinskoj oslobodilačkoj organizaciji. Uprkos prekinutim odnosima nastavljena je prodaja oružja. Izraelski izvori procjenjuju da je između 1981. i 1983. godine Izrael prodao Iranu oružja u vrijednosti $500 miliona, a nakon raspada Sovjetskog saveza 1991. godine i pada Sadama Huseina 2003. godine, u očima Amerike, ali i Izraela, Iran je postao neprijatelj broj 1. Idemo sada do Berlina gdje se nalazi Hamidreza Azizi, vanjsko-politički analitičar Njemačkog instituta za međunarodna i sigurnosna pitanja. Mr. Azizi, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now let me start by asking you, Israel's chief of staff, General Aviv Kochavi, recently warned of a strike against Iran. How was this perceived by the Iranian public and the Iranian government?
Well, actually, Aviv Koshavi's remarks can be considered one of the most direct and toughest threats against Iran by the Israelis in recent years. However, the Iranian reaction actually was more or less similar to the reaction they usually show to the Israeli threats. For example, Mahmoud Vaezi, chief of staff of the Iranian president, called the remarks psychological warfare and said that the Israelis has no plans to attack Iran, nor do they have the ability to do so. On the other hand, Iran's representative to the United Nations, Majid Takhtravanchi, called on the United Nations to react to the growing Israeli threats. On the other hand, we have Iran's military officials who, like usual, actually stress that Iran is ready to defend itself and that any military action will be met with a strong response. So generally speaking, it seems that, of course, the growing threats actually from the Israeli officials and also the increase in direct and indirect Israeli actions against Iran, for example, the sabotage acts, all these things, have raised concerns in Iran, but the Iranian leaders seem to believe that Israel alone or by itself is incapable of conducting a kind of direct military operation against Iran, be it a kind of large-scale military operation or a limited one. And now that Donald Trump actually has left office in the United States, in the Iranian mindset, the likelihood that the United States would join Israel in a kind of move, a preemptive strike against Iran is even less than before. So this
right,
is
but
the...
Mr. Azizi, we have already seen Israelis take unilateral military action against targets in Syria, against targets earlier, 20, 30 years ago in Iraq, also a number of attacks in Iran. For example, the Natanz explosion last year, the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh were blamed on Israel. So do you still believe that Israel really needs the nod from Washington to carry out such military attacks?
These are two different issues, actually. What I just mentioned is about the Israeli ability to do a kind of, for example, a direct military attack against nuclear facilities in terms of conventional warfare, all these kinds of things.
Okay.
So actually, in the Iranian viewpoint, it's like the very covert nature of these operations is an indication that Israel either does not have the ability or the desire to go into a war. So that's how it's perceived.
Right. And now, how was the election of Joe Biden perceived by the Iranian public and his decision to return to the 2015 nuclear deal with Tehran?
Well, generally speaking, Trump's departure and the start of Joe Biden's presidency have raised hopes in Iran, in public and in the government as well, about the possibility of the revival of the nuclear deal and the removal of sanctions. Such a hope, or better to say expectation, has been evident actually in the remarks and statements made by President Rouhani and the other officials in his administration, for example, Foreign Minister Zarif. But on the other side, we have Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, as well as the hardline faction in Iran who continue to express pessimism about Biden's intentions, and they actually believe that Iran should not attach any hope to the new US admin. Although they say Iran should try to get sanctions removal, but there's no special ground for hope. So in any case, the main issue, this is, I think, the most important part with regard to the Iranian viewpoint. The main issue on which actually all political factions, or almost all political factions in Iran now agree, is that it is the United States that should take the first step to revive the nuclear deal. Otherwise, given the growing pessimism in Tehran, which was just exacerbated during Donald Trump years, Iran is not expected to take the initiative in this regard.
Right, and it is interesting that despite numerous threats coming from high-ranking Iranian government and military officials after every assassination of a nuclear scientist or a high-ranking commander, hardly ever does this materialize into a proper military retaliation from the Iranian side. How do you make sense of that?
Well, specifically speaking about the recent cases, for example, the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and also the sabotage acts in Natanz nuclear facility. I think the main reason, actually the most important reason that Iran did not show a response was out of a kind of concern that Donald Trump in his last weeks in office would have taken a kind of military action against Iran. So this issue caused Iran not only take a kind of position of we can say tactical patience, but also Iran was actually trying to not give Donald Trump a kind of excuse to resort to military action. Actually, especially again with regard to the recent activities, Israeli activities against Iran. In the Iranian viewpoint, in the Iranian officials, these kinds of assassinations, sabotage acts, and also the intensification of Israeli attacks against Iranian positions in Syria have been a kind of trap by Israel to push Iran towards a kind of confrontation with the United States. But I think that based on the positions and remarks that I can see on the Iranian side, the very idea of kind of retaliation against Israel is still there. But how and when it's going to happen, it's not clear yet.
Right, and finally, Mr. Azizi, the leadership in Tehran has capitalized on the weakness of Arab states to strengthen its own proxies in the region, from Lebanon to Iraq to Syria to Gaza, even to Yemen, just by training and funding Iranian proxies in the region. Just how elaborate is this network? And to what extent are they really autonomous in their own decision-making?
Well, actually, the thing is that this issue of the level of, being autonomous or independent from Iran is the main factor determining which of them are really proxies and which of them are kind of partners or something. Because, the title of proxy actually indicates to a kind of relationship between a state actor and another actor, be it a kind of non-state actor or another state even, in which the second party, does not have a kind of agency of itself and is completely subordinate to the patron, as they say. So this definition actually can apply to Iran's relations with some of these groups, but not all of them. For example, in Syria, there's a complete kind of network of local and also imported proxies. Iran runs a kind of complete network of local and imported proxies. But for example, in Iraq, especially within the framework of Hashd Shabi or the Popular Mobilization Forces, most of these groups are, can hardly be labeled as proxies. They are close to Iran ideologically. They enjoy Iran's political, financial, and also military support. But in some cases, they have kind of agendas which are not completely in line with that of Iran.
Mr. Hamidreza Azizi, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Iako nemaju bliske diplomatske odnose, Iran i Ujedinjeni Arapski Emirati su bliski trgovinski partneri. Stoga Teheranu nije bilo naročito drago kada su Izrael i Ujedinjeni Arapski Emirati, ali i druge arapske zemlje, uspostavile diplomatske odnose sa Izraelom. Više detalja u nastavku. Idemo sada do Tel Aviva gdje se nalazi Yonatan Touval, izraelski stručnjak sa Instituta za regionalnu politiku, MITVIM. Mr. Touval, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now let me start by asking you, now that relations are thawing between Israel and Gulf Arab states, is Iran perceived as the only remaining enemy state in the region? If so, why?
Yes, you could say so, although we should note that none of the Gulf Arab countries, even those that Israel has not yet established relations with, was ever really a bitter enemy of Israel. There was no peace, but there was also no war. As for Iran, the enmity with Israel is actually quite recent. I would even say that in the grand scheme of things, the enmity is superficial. There is not a deeply rooted conflict. There's no territorial or border dispute, no religious or ethnic conflict. In fact, even over the course of recent history, there was friendship and cooperation. Many people remember that relations were very strong under the Shah. What people tend to forget is that even after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, tacit cooperation between Israel and Iran continued for another decade or so. In fact, as late as 1987, Israel's defense minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, referred to Iran as Israel's best friend. This was at a time, mind you, that Khomeini was still the supreme leader. And I think what Rabin meant by that was that Iran was a geostrategic ally for Israel, because geostrategically, both Israel and Iran shared common threats at the time. There was still the Cold War, and both Iran and Israel had to contend with Soviet influence and specifically Soviet support for pan-Arab nationalism, which posed a direct challenge also to Iran. And there was also Iraq, a belligerent enemy of both Iran and Israel. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, Israel was so concerned that an Iraqi victory would offset the balance of power between Iraq and Iran that it sold arms to Iran. In fact, if you want a sense of just how closely Israel, Iran, and the Reagan administration cooperated, just recall the Iran-Contra affair, a deal struck in the mid-1980s between members of the Reagan administration, Israel, and Iran, under which Israel sold its own outdated US-made arms to Iran and transferred the money to the counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua. So what has changed? Well, if two of the main factors that kept Israel and Iran working together were their shared interests vis-a-vis the Soviets and their influence in the Middle East and the threat from Iraq, then I would say that the year 1991 changed all of that. 1991 being the year that the Soviet Union disintegrated and that Iraq was severely weakened in the first Gulf War. And these two events changed entirely the geopolitical map and marked a turning point. And we saw relations between Iran and Israel beginning to deteriorate and really shift from a kind of cold peace to an increasingly hostile rivalry.
Right.
And under this new world order following 1991, Israel and Iran found themselves really as the two most powerful states in the region. And without having the common threats that pushed them to cooperate, they found themselves on a collision course.
Now, Mr. Touval, what is interesting is that Saudi Arabia has for years been leading a rather hostile anti-Israel campaign in the region. Its school books have been loaded with anti-Semitic content. However, things have rapidly changed over the past couple of years since Mohammed bin Salman became crown prince. So far as Israel is concerned, are the Saudis now acceptable neighbors?
Well, it's a good question. Israel, like probably most countries around the world, is not in a position to choose its neighbors. And it also does not have the privilege to be too picky when it comes to choosing its allies. And when it comes to Saudi Arabia, you're right to point out to the hostile rhetoric of the Saudi regime, especially in the 1970s and 80s, and in some frameworks such as religious sermons and school textbooks until very recently. But just as geostrategic interests have put Iran and Israel on a collision course, it's also geostrategic factors that have pushed Israel and Saudi Arabia to cooperate, even if very gradually and clandestinely over the past 20 years. For Israel, in fact, the interests are pretty clear-cut. Since Saudi Arabia has emerged as the leader of the Arab world, Israel has viewed it as key to normalizing relations with the entire Arab world and beyond, with the Muslim world at large. Whereas for Saudi Arabia, the geostrategic interests are there as well, even though there are other considerations, primarily the kingdom's internal stability and regional status, that counterbalance those interests. It has a very strong public opinion that is pro-Palestinian, following years and years that the regime has championed itself as the champion of the Palestinian cause. It has eternal dissent from Islamist groups. So Riyadh has to proceed very cautiously with normalizing relations with Israel. And there is apparently a very fierce debate within the Saudi royal household as to how far and how fast Saudi Arabia should proceed.
Right. Now, the Biden administration has made it clear it wants to return to the 2015 nuclear deal with Tehran. Why does Israel consider these moves as being wrong and even dangerous?
So when we say Israel, we need to recognize that there are divergent views in Israel, even within the political and military establishment. As to the deal with Iran, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. The most vocal opposition to the agreement has been Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the criticism against the deal focuses on those parts that the agreement doesn't really deal with. To make it simple, we need to understand that in order to become a military nuclear power, Iran would need three things: highly enriched uranium, a functional warhead, and a missile capable of delivering it. Now, the agreement, the JCPOA, addresses only the first of these efforts in any real detail. That is the part of referring to uranium enrichment. It doesn't really address the other components, the ability to develop a functional warhead and to develop missile technology. And even when it comes to that first component of uranium enrichment, it doesn't really adequately address it, according to some critics. It puts limits on Iran's uranium enrichment and gives a pretty good assurance that should Iran decide to violate the agreement and develop a nuclear bomb, the time it would need to, it would require to have enough enriched uranium would be approximately a year, as opposed to something like 3 months, which was the case before the agreement was put in place. But for critics of the deal, the fact that the agreement sets a series of expiration dates on these limits, what is called sunset clauses, ranging from 10 to 15 years, is very problematic, because it means that past these dates, Iran will be legally able to produce as much bomb-grade uranium as it wanted.
Right.
So all of this raises a lot of questions as to the strength of this agreement in the long run. And on the part of the proponents of the agreement, of course, they answer back with a question of whether there's a deal out there that critics of the deal, and Israel in particular, would not find and consider dangerous.
Now, bearing in mind that elections are coming up in Israel, but also in Iran, do you expect more of this warmongering in both countries?
Well, I hope not. It's very hard to say what will happen now in the June elections in Iran. I'm not going to try to predict who wins there the elections. We should always hope that it's the moderates. On the Israeli side, we also have elections, and it's not all that clear that Netanyahu, who has been the fiercest critic of Iran, will be re-elected and be able to form a government. So it's hard to say. And of course, there's the Biden administration, which we all hope would moderate the tensions and enable all sides to move onto a more constructive path.
Right. Mr. Yonatan Touval, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again.
Sure, thank you.
Mnogo se toga promijenilo proteklih mjeseci. Na vlast u Americi je došao novi predsjednik koji se želi vratiti nuklearnom sporazumu sa Iranom, a Izrael se tome protivi i prijeti unilateralnim vojnim akcijama. U regiji je došlo do pomirenja Katara, Saudijske Arabije, Emirata, Egipta i Bahreina i do njihovog zbližavanja sa Izraelom. Stvorena je tako i neformalna alijansa koja Iran smatra najvećom regionalnom prijetnjom. Važnu ulogu igra i Turska, koja ima dobre odnose kako sa Iranom, tako i sa arapskim zemljama, a proteklih sedmica se potajno pomiruje i sa Izraelom. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pogledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.